Okay, my iPhone clock says it's past 10 o'clock, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Are you ready, Leslie?
I'm ready when you are.
Awesome. Hello and welcome to the Rose Setter and Jacobs webinar series. My name is Jessica Leitao. I'm a tax manager here at RSJ. And today I have joining me Leslie Monzon from the Financial Accounting Services Department, also known as FAS. And we're going to be talking about 1099s and what we need to do, what they are, how they get filed, and kind of any burning question you have concerning these lovely informational forms. What I would like to know is that the chat is monitored. So if you have any questions while we are talking, please go ahead and chat to Crystal and she will let us know so that we can get your questions answered before the end of the webinar. So
My
first, I
favorite
guess
thing to talk about.
1099s, the bane of all of our existence at the end of year. Yes. So Leslie, what is a 1099? What is it? Tell us about it.
So 1099s are informational forms that need to be filed for business expenses. It's a way for the IRS to capture income that's not being reported on a W-2 and make sure that it's being accounted for on someone's tax return. But it's also a way to substantiate business expenses.
So when we're talking about substantiating expenses, why is that important?
Well, when we take those business expenses against our income on our tax return, we want to be able to deduct them so we can get our tax income as low as possible and pay only what is needed for taxes. And if we're not filing these returns or these informational returns, there's a chance that we could have our deductions disallowed and not be able to take advantage of those for tax purposes.
Got it. So that's why it actually becomes important not only to receive them, but to actually issue them at the end of the year.
Agreed.
Okay. So today I think we're going to talk about three main 1099s. First, the 1099 miscellaneous, followed by the 1099 NEC, and then we'll go into the 1099K. We'll just touch on that one. So Crystal, if we could show the 1099 miscellaneous on the screen. Awesome. Leslie, do you kind of want to go through what we generally see on this form and why one would get one, why we would receive a 1099 miscellaneous?
Sure. This form is most commonly used when reporting rents. I see rents come through most often on the 1099 miscellaneous form. So if you have a rental property and you have a business that is renting that, you will probably receive a 1099 miscellaneous, and the amount that they paid rent would be in box 1 for rents, and that should tie to what you're reporting on your tax return as income for that property.
Is the rental income box limited to just property, as in real property for a house or an office building, or does that actually go into maybe equipment rental and other things that would fall along those paths?
Equipment rental could be in this box as well, and similar types of rent.
Okay. Let's say that I'm subleasing a space. Would that also be included? Would I?
So yes, and you would potentially, if you're subleasing, you might show the income and also the expense associated with it, so that you want to capture whatever is being reported on the 1099 miscellaneous, if it's correct, and
Mhm.
match it with your return.
Okay. I also see sometimes royalties come through. I think for the most part, those are issued by royalty companies or accounting firms that handle royalties. But just kind of highlighting here that there is a difference between rent and royalties. Because I know that I've had some clients in the past ask why they're getting the royalties, and they're completely separate. So although they may be reported similarly on the tax return in a similar area, those are completely separate boxes and they have completely separate tax issues at hand. I,
Agreed.
I go ahead. Sorry.
I was just agreeing with you. Also, I didn't mention yet that the threshold for reporting on like rental, other items on this form is $600, but for that royalty, it's $10. That's the threshold. So you may get a royalty if you are receiving royalties for a much smaller amount because that threshold is lower.
Okay, so just to make sure that we're all on the same page, we are looking for the 1099s pretty much across the board, with the exception of royalties, at business expenses over $600.
That's
So
correct.
that's what we'll be seeing on these 1099s. All right, we can go ahead and move on to the 1099 NEC. Awesome. So, Leslie, explain to us why this exists, why we changed the rules a few years ago to include this lovely new form.
Yep, this is a newer form. So 1099 miscellaneous has been around for many, many, many years. The NEC form has been around for only a few years now. And really, what this was created for was to report non employee compensation. That's what the NEC stands for. It is also a $600 threshold for filing. Um, but on the old form, the miscellaneous, they had so many people using different boxes, it became really confusing when it was coming down to non employee compensation type of work. So they created this form just for all the people getting non employee compensation.
So, I guess going on that same exact thread, uh, I often get the question, what's the difference between the 1099 miscellaneous other income box and a 1099 NEC? Because I think we see the most issues surrounding 1099s being issued at the end of the year with these two things.
Agreed. And for people that still are not realizing that there is an NEC form, sometimes they're filing on the miscellaneous. There's only a few reasons to use the other income on the miscellaneous form, and they're very unlikely to see. Most often, you will see it on this non-employee compensation form. So it could be for services rendered, and that's most often what I see it for.
Awesome. I think we also wanted to touch on with these 1099s, a majority of what we see come through 1099s is for services. These aren't really for tangible goods. So that's a completely
Right.
separate reporting. So again, we're really focusing on services or expenses over $600. And it's nothing usually tangible being exchanged. I think with the exception of raffles, but then again, that's a very niche area that we're not going to go too far into today, but that would be on your 1099 miscellaneous as well.
Agreed. And so things like merchandise, no, there's no 1099 required because there is that exchange involved. There's a couple of other reasons you may not file a 1099, and that would be for utility like your phone, things like that. It can be perceived maybe as a service, but really it's not needed for a 1099.
And I think we also just wanted to touch on really fast too, especially concerning the 1099 NEC, what we see concerning legal and accounting fees. I think there's a little bit of confusion there. So would you like to explain a little bit more?
Sure. Basically, attorneys get a lot of attention on the 1099 forms. Um, no matter, you know, what they're getting paid for, there needs to show up on a 1099. So on the 1099 miscellaneous, there is a box that for like gross proceeds, if you were paying for a settlement on a legal settlement and you had to pay out in accordance with that settlement, it would go in the gross proceeds box right in there, number 10. And that would be often it's paid to the attorney who then turns it over to the whoever's receiving it on the other end. So if you were to pay that settlement out, you would want to fill out this 1099 miscellaneous and fill out box 10. Now, if you were paying for attorney services, I had somebody draft up our partnership agreement or something similar. Then it would be on the 1099 NEC form, and that would be in box 1.
I always like to think you'll know when you have to issue the 1099 miscellaneous for the gross settlement fees. So if you are not aware, most likely it's not going to be on that box and you need to issue the 1099 NEC. Would you say that's a pretty good way to go?
Yes, I think most people are very aware that they're having to pay out for a settlement, something where a judge has determined that they have to pay out. Most likely, all the majority of the forms that I see are on this form for those legal services.
I agree. And I think, as the switch happened a few years ago, a majority of our services are getting paid through the 1099 NEC. So again, just to reiterate what Leslie already said, we really want to be careful that we're not using the 1099 miscellaneous box 5 for income that should be getting or expenses that should be getting reported on the 1099 NEC. So if you're thinking, lawyer fees, accounting fees, even consulting fees, anything you're paying out to that, get that expertise and service, it's most likely going on your 1099 NEC. Is that a great way to just summarize that?
I think that's a great way to summarize it.
Perfect. Okay. We're going to go ahead and touch on the 1099K because this has, become a little bit more of a hot issue in the last couple of years as well.
I agree, especially, since COVID and so many things have moved online, a lot of people are selling online. So through eBay, through so many online platforms that you can sell through. And if you're selling a good amount, you may receive a 1099K from the third party selling platform or a credit card processor. Those are the different reasons that I'm seeing them come up, especially for people who hadn't received them in the past. I see eBay as a common, went to go sell my items on there, and now they're receiving a 1099K and they've never received it before. So really, payments, that are something by credit card, if you sold tickets, concert tickets, things like that, you might get a 1099K. Or, you sold eBay, you sold all sorts of things can crop up on this form. But it's really with that third party processor. And so if you take credit card and your business takes credit card and you go out to, markets or such and you're swiping credit cards, it'll show up on this type of form. And you'll want to make sure that you have enough, that you're going to show enough income to support that on your tax return.
So this includes things like Square and
Correct.
any type of point of service device that doesn't necessarily tie to like MasterCard, Visa, or American Express. So this
Agreed.
is any type of vendor. Okay. And
Right.
I guess,
Even those small ones.
right. So I guess my next question is the filing threshold the same? So if you sell or receive less than $600, will you be receiving a 1099K? How does that work?
So the regulators have been trying to put that kind of limit in, but it's not quite there yet. It's much higher.
Okay.
And eventually, I see this form going to have a similar limit. I know the regulators want to get it down to $600, but of course the credit card processors and such have been lobbying against it just because it's such a large workload to take on suddenly. But they've been talking about doing that for years now. So I would not be surprised if in the next few years we get down to that $600 threshold for filing this.
So I've seen a lot of news about Venmo and your business account for Venmo. Is this what they're talking about when they're saying they're going to issue the 1099 if you have
That's
a business
correct.
account? Okay, so we're looking for 1099Ks coming from Venmo for any business accounts.
Now it's important to notice Zelle though. Zelle is
Hmm.
a different type of um, platform. Zelle is really a transfer between banks and not so much a credit card processor. And they have fought and successfully fought against having to file 1099s for now, so that they're just seen as a transfer between banks. And Zelle is not required to issue 1099s now. So if you are looking at 1099s, you may potentially have to issue, and it was through Zelle, you need to include those in the consideration to file.
Awesome. Okay, but it won't necessarily come through an outside reporting form.
Correct.
Awesome. Okay, so again, that would rely on our financials and less on someone else giving us information.
Correct.
All right, so I think we've kind of moved into this. So let's move into our due dates and extensions for 1099s. Because I know that this can be a much debated topic as to when 1099s actually have to be issued and filed, and what do we have to do with them? What are our requirements?
So the big deadline is the end of January. So it's the 31st, unless the 31st falls on the weekend, and then it will be the first business day after. This year, January 31st is a weekday, so that will be the deadline. Without any extension or anything, you must file a copy you must furnish a copy to your recipient. Whoever's received the money, they need to receive that copy by the 31st. So it needs to be postmarked by the 31st or emailed by the 31st if you are sending it electronically. And the IRS copy and state copy also need to be filed by that date. There
Okay, yes, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, there are some extensions, but they are difficult to obtain. So you can fill out a form to get an IRS extension. However, the recipient copy to the person that received the money is still due by the 31st. It's very, very difficult to obtain an extension for that recipient copy. And the reason is because the people receiving those are trying to file their returns. And if those are delayed, they can't file their returns.
So is there a punishment or anything that happens if you are not furnishing the recipient copy by the 31st?
Absolutely. The IRS can come in and issue a fine or a penalty per form. And I have not personally seen this happen. However, the IRS and other regulatory agencies have been very vocal that they are moving towards um,
Being
laying
more
down those
stringent? Right.
penalties and actually enforcing it.
So, with those extensions, what is your suggestion for the state jurisdictions when we're talking about due dates and extensions as well? Is there a similar
So the states are an interesting topic. I'll say it that way. There is some, and if you're going to file electronically, which if you need to file more than 10 informational returns, you need to file electronically. If you file electronically and you use software like QuickBooks Online or something that a software that participates in the combined filing program for 1099s, you only need to file the federal copy, and the software, excuse me, the IRS will share that copy with the state that participates in that combined filing program. For instance, California participates in the combined filing program. And if you file with something like QuickBooks Online with the federal government, they automatically share with the state of California that copy. So you are having, if for filing in one place, you're getting both your federal and state copies filed.
right?
If you use software that doesn't participate in that program, you will need to file a state copy, and it's by the 31st
Okay,
for most states and most reasons. However, each state, of course, has its
it's different.
own deadlines and its own rules. So you may have to look into that specific state to find the specific rules associated with it.
So focusing on California just a little bit, if we are not participating in a software that will automatically send it to that jurisdiction for California, is it a similar process for filing as we would do for Fed? So we would use the federal system and then separately go into the California system? Is
That's
that what
correct.
you're okay?
That's correct.
So double the work for a single.
Yes.
All right, just making sure we're all clear on that.
Yes.
So now that we know our due dates and we know what kind of extensions look like, let's talk about what actually happens when you need to issue 1099. So really, we've talked about we have a filing threshold of $600. What are kind of the next steps? We're in January now. We know that we have this due date coming up very quickly. How do we get the information that we need?
Well, hopefully, when you issue a payment for business expenses that you have a good likelihood of needing to issue a 1099, hopefully you got a W-9 from that vendor when you issued the payment originally, and you already have them all on hand. So, and that W-9 would include that information. It would include the company name, their tax identification number, or their individual name and their social security number, their address, and all the other things that would be needed on a Form 1099. If you didn't get those ahead of time, you'll need to go back to those vendors and request those W-9s, because that will be the best way, and really, in my mind, the only way to get the information needed for your 1099s.
And I think touching on those W-9s for a second, there's a really important point with that. When we receive a 10 or W-9, we are actually informed about how that person or entity is taxed. So I think, talking about that, corporations don't need to receive 1099s for the most part. Is that something we want to talk about a little bit?
Sure, yes. We do not need to issue 1099s for corporations or S corps. And LLCs if they're taxed as a corporation. But the way you would find that out is if you received a W-9, it would tell you all that information, and you would then know if you need to issue a 1099 to that company or not.
And I think we have to go back and talk about our mini exception that we spoke about a little bit when we were talking about NECs. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think attorneys are the only ones that are kind of an exception to this rule. Is that right?
That's the most common exception. There's some very obscure exceptions, but that is the one I see most often. So attorneys, no matter if they're how they're formed, you will always need to issue them a 1099 for the services that they've performed.
Okay, so
over that
regardless,
$600. Yes,
so regardless if you pay legal fees and they come back with a W-9 that says corp, we are going to go ahead and issue that 1099 if it's over $600.
that's correct.
Great. So now we have our W-9s. We're kind of getting ready to go, and now we're trying to look and total our expenses. And I know that most of us in our financial statements are going to have credit card expenses. We have sometimes accrued expenses, and we have our cash expenses. So when we're looking at issuing 1099s, what number are we really looking for, and how do we make sure that we are issuing the correct amount to those receivers?
That's a great question. And it's something that comes up so often. And it's really the cash that you've paid outside of a credit card. If you've paid with your credit card, then that payment is captured in the 1099K from that credit card processor. And they're already getting a 1099 for that payment. If you've paid by cash or check or Zelle, then that would be the payments that you would want to capture and include for your 1099 reporting.
So I guess that kind of comes into question, and we can kind of move into this a little bit. What if we issue a 1099 and our cash payments don't align? So we have it on our books that we paid something out, and it doesn't actually, the person receiving the money didn't receive it till maybe like mid-January. It was a check, and it just, we have it on our books that we paid it, it wasn't received, and they're coming back to us and telling us that we have issued an incorrect 1099. How does that process work? What does that look like?
So that's always an issue that comes up near year end, and a lot of
Right.
people are trying to make payments near year end. And it comes down to the IRS understands that there's a timing difference from when it's paid by a business, maybe at the end of the year, and it's not going to be actually cashed once it gets through the mail or the however it's supplied to that vendor. There might be a timing difference, and most often I've seen they're okay if there's a difference, meaning when you go to file your return, that there's a little difference between that one payment. But if you need to come back and if it really is a mistake that's why they're not matching up, then you may need to amend that 1099. And there's a process for going through and filing a corrected one. And you do need to mark any corrected or amended 1099 as such. If you file another 1099, the IRS sees it as another payment and will double those. So if you reported $600 on one and $600 on the other, the IRS sees a total of $1,200. And they're going to be looking for that to be reported on the other side.
So and again, we spoke briefly earlier about that process, and if we're going to amend, it's going to be the same thing in terms of filing with the IRS and then filing that same corrected one with the state if we're not using an all-inclusive software.
That's correct.
Okay, so that's something we want to be judicious of. I think what I also wanted to touch on, and you talked about a little bit earlier, is that our 1099Ks, so for us personally, if we are paying out on credit card, do we need to follow up with the credit card company to make sure that those vendors are receiving them? How does that work from our
No,
side?
we don't have to worry about it. It's not our responsibility. So we have to believe that the credit card companies are handling it and that they are going to file it appropriately. We do not need to follow up.
So I think our biggest responsibility in terms of credit card expenses is making sure that we're not doubling up and
Correct.
issuing a 1099 for something that
Right.
should be covered under the credit card. Okay, cool.
And something along that line, if you pay a vendor both by credit card and by cash, make sure that you can see the difference in those and only report the cash amount. So
Okay.
a lot of vendors have, moved over to accepting credit card because it's made it easier for them to collect their money. You might have paid the first part of the year with cash or check or something like that, and the second part of the year might have been, credit card, and that would be an important difference to note and make sure that you're only reporting the cash payment that you made.
Okay. I know that can get a little bit confusing, especially when we lump all of our expenses in the same bucket. But again, I think using people that understand how these work is probably the best alternative because it's getting a lot. Credit card
Yes.
payments have changed the world, and I think it's changing the tax reporting world very, very quickly. So I think we want to talk about this, and you and I have discussed this a lot. Um, but do we really use 1099s as an income driver? We're receiving 1099s now. What is How do we interpret them? What do we do? How does that get reported? What am I doing now?
So the 1099 that you receive hopefully is not a surprise. You hopefully already know about it and you've already included it with your taxable income. The fact that it's reported on a 1099 does not designate that it's taxable. It's taxable if you've received it as part of your business in the first place, and the 1099 is just corroborating that. You may not, because maybe uh, you have a lot of customers that are paying you from personal expenses, and personal expenses aren't going to be included on a 1099. So maybe the total number of your 1099s that you've received doesn't add up to the total amount that you're reporting on your tax return. And that's fine. We're not expecting the 1099s from those personal customers, but it would substantiate the same number that you're reporting for all of your business customers.
Got it. And I think in terms of the tax prep side, when we're receiving 1099s, we're really looking to make sure that if they are not equating, what is going on? So, where are we either missing or have additional income that maybe isn't coming through a 1099, which is totally fine and normal, but really making sure that we have a reason. That's usually what I'm really looking for, the driver, especially on the tax prep side, is if I'm seeing 1099s come in, um, and we need to report that income, I would expect your financials to be probably more than the 1099s that we receive. If they are less, that is probably something that we would need to talk about.
Agreed. And it could be indicative of an error, or it could
Mhm.
be indicative, well, an error on, the side of the person issuing the 1099, or the person's, maybe there's something wrong with the bookkeeping, or, there was um, the accounting system didn't link up with um, with the bank, and we didn't quite get all the information.
Right.
So it could be indicative of a problem or something else or an error.
So we talked about a little bit if we issue the incorrect 1099 and we receive that information, that we have to refile. What if we are issued an incorrect 1099? So we receive it and we're like, this is incorrect. What do we do? What are the next steps?
Then we go back to the person that issued the 1099 and let them know that there's a problem and that they need to file a corrected 1099 to report the correct information.
Great. And we kind of already touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to kind of go over once again, how do 1099s get reported on the tax return? What does that really look like? We can kind of take this, both of us.
Yes. So, if I mean, depending on the type of tax return and the forms that you're filing, you're not going to see them necessarily as a separate item. Like, it's not
Mhm.
going to show up as like 1099 income. It's going to be included in that gross income.
I think
Did
that's
you
the
want to
best way to put it.
elaborate?
Yeah, we can talk a little bit more, but we talked about on the 1099 miscellaneous how we do have that rental and that royalty income, and I would expect if I'm receiving or helping prep a return that is receiving those 1099s that we would then put them in the specific buckets. So as you already said, we don't necessarily have a line item that says 1099 rental income. It would be then included in your bigger bucket of rental income reported on whatever type of return you're doing. I think that can be a little bit confusing when it comes to 1099 NECs, especially if you are a Schedule C filer.
Yes.
So we do actually have to input every single 1099 that is received for those specific circumstances and then judiciously put them in the correct place, most likely being your Schedule C if you're an individual. And I wanted to just touch on that a little bit and why that's a little bit important when we're receiving 1099s to be careful of what
Yes.
type of 1099 we're receiving. So we talked earlier about the difference between the 1099 miscellaneous and the 1099 NEC. And I think this is really where it comes into play. So that miscellaneous other income box doesn't necessarily designate the same type of income to be reported as the NEC. So again, I think for everyone looking forward to this 1099 season, we really want to make sure that when we're receiving those 1099s that we're looking at them, that they are correct. Because those two things are taxed differently.
Agreed. And also on the side of the IRS and the state that they're being filed in, they are looking to see if that's a NEC, most often they're looking for that specific NEC form to be noted on that tax return on an individual level. So if it's not there, it sometimes can kick off a notice just saying, hey, it looks like something's missing.
And I think even on our tax filing side, there are pretty stringent requirements in order to not report an NEC as Schedule C income. And I think like basically you're saying I should have been an employee and I wasn't. And so you're then highlighting whoever issued it to you as someone that probably needs to go through and check if they're treating their outside contractors as employees. So we really want to be careful there that if you are receiving an NEC, for whatever reason, whatever type of entity you are, that you are actually performing that work and that you are not supposed to be treated as an employee. And that is a totally separate issue for a different webinar. But again, our 1099s with our independent contractors, the rules are getting a lot more strict as who should be an independent contractor and who should be an employee. And this is really the IRS's way of taking care of the independent contractor side of income. And we really, again, want to be careful that if we are not crossing that bridge of saying, hey, we shouldn't be receiving this, we're actually an employee, because that opens up an entirely different can of worms.
Agreed. And it's important that no, if you do have employees, they should be getting W-2s and none of their information should show up on a 1099
And I think
for their services.
I
Yeah,
think we've had that too. And again, there are circumstances where maybe you were an independent contractor part of the year and then you went on to payroll after, which is fine. Um, I don't typically see it in conjunction. So I don't see that
agreed.
you can't, I don't know how you would do that. And if you are in that specific circumstance, I would definitely be reaching out to your tax professional to make sure that it's being handled correctly.
Agreed.
So I guess to kind of close out, we're at that point of the month. We're about midway through January, 2 weeks away from our deadline. Leslie, what is your best advice for anyone that has not started their 1099 journey?
Get started right away. Don't wait. Get those W-9s because sometimes it's difficult to get a hold of your vendors and get those as soon as possible. And maybe if you don't have them now, make it a point when you issue payment next year, make sure to get that W-9 first. Vendors are usually much quicker about providing them when they want to get their payment than later on when it's easier to push it off. So get those in and have that stuff done as soon as, have that information in that you can do anytime during the year so it's not a big scramble.
I did have one question come through. So
Sure.
let me just add this really quick. I am not a calendar year filer. I am a fiscal year. So how do I, tell me more. What do I do?
Okay. So like employee wages, 1099s are on a cash basis, but they're on a calendar year. So because they so often link up with individuals who file on a calendar year, I think that's why the IRS kind of went that way. So you're going to need to come up with the payments and or the information that you think is going to be needed to file for 1099 on that calendar year basis
Okay.
and on that cash basis.
Do you think the IRS or any jurisdiction is, obviously wrapping up your year-end books within 2 weeks can be difficult. What do you think if someone was saying, hey, I'm just really not ready to file 1099s? Do you think that there's going to be some type of leniency given there? What does that look like?
Again, the IRS has very, very strict rules on when things need to be filed. It's very difficult to get extensions, and they've made it very, very apparent that they're moving in the direction of leveling penalties.
Okay.
I I would say go as quick as you can and try to get them done as fast as possible. I don't see really much leniency there. With the amount of information that's been coming from the IRS for the past several years, they've made it very apparent that they want this done timely.
Great. I actually have one other question.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I believe I should have been issued a 1099 and I wasn't. Do I contact the vendor? Do I proceed to try to get my 1099? What are your thoughts there?
Really, it doesn't, you don't have to have it. It's really on the issuer It's their responsibility to make sure they're filing the 1099. It's not your responsibility to make sure that they're doing it. And since you have to report your income, no matter if it's filed on a 1099 or not, it's not really something that you need to follow up on.
Okay, great. I have a question that says, in the case of a vendor who refuses to provide a W-9, how do we go about submitting the 1099? So the vendor will not give it to us, and I've actually encountered this myself. They
Mm-hmm.
either don't know how to give you they don't know what a W-9 is. They're scared about, reporting the income on their side. What do we do?
I have had this also, and I've had to insist on them providing one.
Okay,
And it is their responsibility to provide one. It's not it's just it's their responsibility, and they need to do so as, you know, their as part of their business. Um, and that's why I encourage going forward to get a copy of that W-9 before you issue payment. It's much easier if they don't want to give you one, then it's a concern that maybe you don't want to use them as a vendor because it's going to be very difficult to work with them, and maybe you would want to consider a different vendor.
I know,
And
yeah,
go ahead.
I agree with you, and I know that, and we don't ever, if that person is relentless and not giving it to you, I would not hold up the entirety of your 1099 process to accommodate that person. You can file using their name and I think a substitute EIN or social security number in that case. And then it'll pretty much alert the jurisdiction that there's something going on there. So again,
Agreed.
if someone is really being that insistent that they're not going to give it to you, don't hold up your process. Go ahead and do what you need to do and just go ahead and file with that. I would say like a temporary ID. It really just is a big red flag to the jurisdiction that something's going on and that this number was not given. So
Agreed. And that would be last ditch effort.
correct,
Yeah,
correct.
I would not opt for that under any
No,
circumstances
definitely,
if
yeah,
there's another
definitely,
pathway
yeah.
forward. Yeah.
Definitely try first. But again, if someone, I mean, I've had the case where like we just could not get the information. But it's no need to make yourself late or to not issue. Go ahead and
Yes.
issue with the information you have available. But again, try every effort to get that W-9. And if you are working with a tax professional, you can kind of let them know. And there are ways for us sometimes to come and get that FEIN number. Sometimes it just takes a call from your tax
Yes.
accountant, and it scares people right into giving you the information.
I agree with that.
I think that is it, unless anyone else has any more questions. We would like to thank everyone for attending our webinar on 1099 today. If you would like a copy of this recording or a bullet point list of anything we went over, please go ahead and contact Crystal. She will very easily provide you with all of the content we have covered, and we look forward to having you guys next time. Thank you so much. And thank you, Leslie.
Thank you, Jessica. It's been fabulous.
Okay. Have a great day, everyone.